Okay, so welcome to this segment as I try to guide you again, through the biology GCE 2025. Sorry, I have to redo the video again because I think I was actually disturbed. We start again with question number 1. It says a student used a light microscope to observe onion cells. The power of the ocular lens was at 10 times and the objective lens was 20 times the magnification of the onion cell. So like I said, if you are using the actual microscope and you want to find the magnification, you just need to multiply the ocular lens times the objective lens. The ocular lens is what we sometimes call as being the eyepiece lens. So in this case, they have given us, for the ocular lens 10, the objective lens is 20. So when you multiply it will give us 200. So D was the best option. Then what is the correct level of organization for the skin? We know the skin is an organ. So if you want to remember, you can recall C, torso, cell, tissue, organ, system, and organism. So cells make up tissue, tissues form up an organ system, a group of system working together, they form up an organism. Then 3 says the following diagram shows a setup to demonstrate osmosis. The Viskin tubing represents the plant cell. So a Viskin tubing is a tube that is selectively permeable, or it has got tiny pores that allow smaller molecules to pass through. So they are telling us it represents a plant cell. Then which setup would demonstrate plasmolysis? So now plasmolysis is a situation where a cell loses water, and why it loses water, it's because it has been placed in an hypertonic solution. A solution surrounding the cell is highly concentrated. As a result, water will start moving out by a process we call as being osmosis. So if you look at this one here, both in the Viskin and inside of the beaker whatsoever they gave us, there's still distilled water. Nothing will happen in this one here. What about when it comes to this one? There's sugar in both sides, so nothing will happen in there. So we are looking at the 2 situation. Now if you look at this one, it's not possible, but outside in the beaker there's sugar solution, then the inside of the Viskin tube there's distilled water. So water will start moving out into the more concentrated solution, and that will lead to what we call in a plant cell, what we call as being plasmolysis. So the best option was actually A there. 4. Which of the following shows the correct region of action and conditions for the enzyme trypsin? So the enzyme trypsin basically works in a region that we call as being the duodenum. This is found in the small intestines, or the ileum as you are calling it in this case. And in the duodenum, it is actually alkaline. So the best option there was actually B. 5 says 4 solutions were tested for the presence of proteins, starch, and glucose. The following table shows the results obtained. Which result shows presence of proteins, glucose, but no starch? So if you still remember, proteins, when proteins are actually present, it is actually going to give you purple. When starch is present, it is going to give you what we call blue, black. Then when glucose or sugars are actually are present, in this case you may actually have orange or brick red. So now when it comes to proteins, the test is simply called as being a burette test, where you are going to have a purple if at all it's present. For iodine, if it is present, it was going to be blue-black. But because they told us there's no starch, it means it will still retain the brown color of the iodine. So it's called the iodine test. Then glucose, which is sugar, it's a Benedict test. It is going to be orange. Therefore, the correct option was that. For this is representing proteins called the burette test. That is starch representing the iodine test, and this is glucose or sugar representing the Benedict test. And that is the way you needed to go about it there. Number 6 says which of the following nutritional disorders can be caused by lack of calcium in the diet? So what can cause? Of course, lack of calcium causes rickets. When it comes to scurvy, you need some vitamins. Constipation, you need dietary fiber, or what we call as being roughage. 7 says the diagram shows the shapes of the cells in a section of a leaf. So if you remember, the upper part, we can just label them. That is what we call as being the upper, epidermis. That's the upper epidermis. Then this section here is representing, cells that we call as being the palisade, mesophyll cells, or the palisade cells. Then these here are representing what we call the spongy cells, or the spongy mesophyll cells. So it's a layer that forms up the spongy mesophyll layer, which cells contain, chloroplast. The truth is that when you look at the cells that actually contain chloroplast, from what they have actually given us, it would have actually been C, the best option. That is I, the palisade cells, the spongy cells, and even, what we are calling as being the gut cells. But of course, those, if you look at them, they have got very small amount, but from what they have given us, C is the best option there. 8 says the diagram shows the structure of a rhizopus. So they have given us a rhizopus. If you still remember, M is representing the sporangiophore. Then the horizontal ones that are going horizontally, those are what we call as being the stolon. Those that are root-like, those are what we simply call as being the rhizoids. So we call them as being the rhizoids. Then that is representing the sporangium. Yeah, and those are, microscopic seeds that are going to be ejected. So identify the labeled structures L and M. So L is representing the stolon is made up of what we are calling as being the hypha. So we can simply call it as being a hypha, and M the sporangiophore. So that should have been the correct option there. Let's move on and see what we can actually do there. Number 9 says the diagram shows a molar, tooth. So remember the molar close to, the back of your mouth, and you can see, the roots and also the cusp on top there. It says which two characteristics in the diagram could be used to identify the tooth. So what could we use? So it has actually ridges, those things that you're able to see on top, those are called ridges. Then it has got 2 roots, so that should have been the best option. Which of the following is an energy-rich carbohydrate stored in the liver and muscle? So remember, an energy-rich carbohydrate stored in the liver and the muscles, no doubt about it. So they're simply telling us which of is an energy-rich carbohydrate. So remember, you might have been tempted to go to glucose. Glucose is not stored in the liver. No, has to be converted first of all into glycogen. So glycogen is what is stored in the liver and the muscles. The glucose is converted into, glycogen first before it can actually be stored. 11. Which of the following is a characteristic of emphysema? So emphysema is actually characterized by, when you breathe deeply or very hard, you actually, end up destroying the alveoli or the air sacs. So it is characterized by destruction of the alveolus. That's the characteristic of emphysema. It says which of the 12, which of the following element has a great role in energy storage and transfer in living organisms? So which of the following element has a great role? So there's calcium, magnesium, oxygen, and phosphorus. So among these, the best is actually, phosphorus. It has got a lot. We are going to find it in nucleic acids in the body. Which of the following diseases is caused by cystosoma? So cystosoma is actually, bilharzia. Of course, you still remember, vibrio cholera, and you still remember about tuberculosis, so you can simply, go through that, and the HIV virus. 14. What type of immunity do babies obtain from the mother through breastfeeding? So when a baby is actually being breastfed by the mother, they actually have what we call as being, artificial, passive immunity. So that's what we simply call as being artificial passive immunity, because they are actually obtaining it, through breastfeeding from the mother. It's not natural but artificial there. 15, the diagram shows the stem of a plant whose bark has been removed. So the moment the bark has been removed, it simply means that you have removed the what? The phloem vessel. So that's what you need to remember. And the phloem actually transports what we are calling as being manufactured food, such as amino acids. And in most cases, this amino acid is manufactured in the leaves. So how is transport in the plant affected? So it is affected in the sense that the amino acid and the sucrose that can be transported along the phloem cannot pass to the roots from the leaves, because that's where it is actually going to be manufactured. Right? 16, the diagram shows blood and its composition. Which component of blood represents the phagocyte? So remember, phagocyte, there are two. This is a type of white blood cells. There are two types of white blood cells: the phagocyte and the lymphocyte. So phagocytes carry out phagocytosis. So you'll be able to see they will be able to change their shape. And if you look at this one, I think D qualifies. If you look at the shape, it is capable of actually changing. These may represent quite all right. These may represent it seems as if they're the red blood cells, but they could be the lymphocyte, and these could be the platelets. 17, which chamber in the heart would be the first to receive nicotine absorbed into the blood in the lungs of a cigarette smoker? So if you look at the heart, if that is the heart, so you have got the left part, and you have got actually the right hand side, and from the lungs, blood comes to the left hand side, specifically what we call as being the atrium. So it is the left atrium that you're going to have there. So that's what we mean there. 18, the diagram shows the kidney and blood vessels associated with it. So that's there representing the kidney. Are you able to name this part? You look at the direction of the arrow. So X is representing what we call as being the renal artery, and the one coming out there is simply called as being the renal vein. And this one, though they have not named it, that is called the ureter. Yeah, remember that is the cortex. The next part that follows is the medulla, and that other part somewhere here is called the pelvis. So this is an internal structure of what we are calling as being the kidney. So it says vessel X contains more urea than Y. It is very much true. There is more urea coming because the function of the kidney is to remove urea, excess salt, and water. Then vessel Y contains urine. No, so this is not true. The urine is found in the ureter. So this is the one going towards the bladder. Then vessel X contains more oxygen than Y. So vessel X contains more oxygen than Y. Can we say that vessel X contains more oxygen than Y? Yes, it is very true, because it needs to supply to the cells of the kidney. So there will be more oxygen brought in than what is actually going to move out, because Y will have more carbon dioxide. Which of the statement 1, 2, 3 are correct? Obviously 1 and 3 are actually correct. Let's move on to 19. What changes take place in the diameter of the arterioles near the skin and urine production in the kidneys when core temperature of the body increases above normal? So when it increases above normal, what happens to the to the diameter of the arterioles near the skin? So when the temperature increases above normal, it actually increases the diameters of the blood vessels close to the skin will actually dilate or become wider, so that they could allow heat to actually be lost to the external environment or outside the body. But in terms of urine production, when it is actually too hot, what happens in this case to urine urine production. So remember, it talks about what happens to urine, production. So the diameter of the arterioles, when the temperature rises above normal, you are going to find that the arterioles actually increase, but when it comes to urine production, yes, urine production, when it is actually hot, the body will not actually, lose a lot of water. The water will actually be conserved. You may pass out concentrated urine, but much water will not be lost because your body still needs water. So I think I would go for C. The diameter of the arterioles increases, then urine production will decrease. Let's go to 20. Which substance increases the blood sugar levels when a person is frightened? Which substance increases? We know adrenaline is called the fight or flight hormone. So it actually causes the conversion of the stored glycogen. So the glycogen that has been stored in your liver and muscle may be converted back to glucose so that the level may actually be high. So adrenaline is actually the hormone that causes an increase in that. So this is representing your brain. The diagram shows part of the human brain. Which part controls breathing rate and regulate blood pressure? So what are the parts? First of all, let's try to label. If you look at that, this is called, the cerebrum. So that's the cerebrum. That is actually representing the hypothalamus. That is the cerebellum, and this is representing the medulla. That is representing the medulla oblongata. That's what we mean. So which one controls breathing rate and regulates blood pressure? It is actually the medulla oblongata. So it actually controls, what we simply call involuntary, actions like breathing. You don't have to, it automatically does happen. So involuntary muscle action. Let's go to 22. Which part of the ear contains the smallest bones in the human body, known as ossicles? So the ossicles, the smallest part of the brain, smallest bones in the human body are found in your ear, and actually the middle ear contains, these. There's what we call, I love to remember them as being the meas. There's what we call the malleus. We have what we call the incus, and we have what we call the stirrup. So these are the three bones, and they are simply known as being the ossicles. They are found in the middle ear. Remember the middle ear consists of the outer, the middle, and the inner ear. Let's go to 23. Which of the following pairs of bones form a hinge joint? So which of the following pairs form a hinge joint? The humerus and fibula, no, these are not, they are too different. The humerus and the ulna, yes, that one falls into place. The scapula and that, no. The scapula and the fibula, no, those are not. B was the correct option there. An experiment on the growth of a young plant shoot was set up as shown. So this is what they set up. The shoot was covered with aluminium foil. Obviously, the aluminium foil would prevent light from reaching this portion. So what will the shoot look like after 48 hours? Well, it will not bend in the direction of light because the tip where you find auxins, it has actually been covered, so you may find it just growing, upward there. All right. 25. Which of the following regions of growth in roots involves an increase in the size of vacuoles? So an increase, if the vacuoles actually increase, it may involve cell elongation. So the vacuole will increase there. 26 says the diagram shows a section through a dicotyledonous seed. Which structure provides most of the nutrient needed for the seed to grow after germination? So after germination, which one is actually needed? So it says which structure provides most of the nutrients needed. So most of the nutrient is actually provided by this part called the cotyledon. It is actually the food storage organ, in dicot. That is what we call as being the plumule, which later on develops into a shoot, and this is representing the the radicle that later on develops into a root, and that is called the seed coat, sometimes called the tester. So there, the cotyledon is actually the food storage organ in what we call as being dicot seeds. In monocot, you have the endosperm. So don't forget that, very important. 27 says, which statements best applies to organisms that reproduce asexually? Yeah, you don't need a partner. So in other words, yourself, you don't need another sexual partner. So offspring always grow to the same height. Okay, offspring are genetically identical. Organism only reproduce asexually during extreme condition. Organism reproduction happens by fusion of diploid nuclei. The best one is that one. Offspring are genetically identical. They are always genetically identical. You can talk about sugar cane, you can talk about bananas, how they reproduce, asexually. That's a type of vegetative, propagation. 28, the diagram shows how a large number of carrots plants can be produced from small pieces of carrot roots. So they get roots of carrots from the plant, and these are grown, then they germinate into. Which of the following is correct for the method of plant production? What's basically correct? So this is what we call asexual reproduction, as noted above. Then the children are genetically identical, like we said. Then cell division is actually by mitosis and not meiosis. So I would go for that. Asexual reproduction, yes. Genetically identical offspring, yes. Cell division by mitosis, but not by meiosis there. Thank you. 29. What is the function of the sepals of most flowers? So the sepals are the green, they look green under a flower, and those are the ones that protect the ovary, especially during its earliest stage of germination. 30. The diagram shows a type of flower. So this type, what type of a flower is this one? Is it an insect or a wind pollinated? Well, looking at the structure, this is actually a wind pollinated type of flower, because you can see the hairy or feathery stigma and the anthers hanging outside. So identify the method of pollination that occurs in the flower. So the method of pollination is actually wind pollination there. Let's move on and complete this section together. Don't give up. Let's go. We are almost done. During the menstrual cycle, hormone M is released in the body to stimulate the production of ova, and then followed by the release of hormone N, which brings about ovulation. So the one that brings about ovulation is what we call as being the luteinizing hormone. Then the one that brings about production of the ova is simply the follicle stimulating hormone. So I would have gone for C as the best option. Which of the following method of birth control involves prevention of ejaculation into the vagina? Well, these are all methods of birth control, but prevention of ejaculation of sperms into the vagina is simply the withdrawal method. When a man wants to ejaculate, instead of ejaculating into the vagina, he will pull out the penis to ejaculate outside. So that's what's called a withdrawal method. Intrauterine, you ejaculate in there. The rhythm method during or safe period method, you ejaculate there, and spermicide, you also ejaculate there. You don't prevent the sperm, but withdrawal prevents that. Which of the following characteristic is an example of continuous variation? Continuous variation is a type of variation where an organism shows many intermediate forms between two extremes. In other words, this is affected by the environment. And which one is that one? It's actually height. Blood group, color of eyes, and sex, all these are what we simply call as being discontinuous variation. They cannot change. They are not affected by the environment. But height changes actually. You can talk about that. The diagram shows one of the stages of mitosis. I love to remember the stages of mitosis as international prime minister arrested and tortured. This one is what we call as being interphase. It is normally not considered a stage of mitosis, but they say the cell is actually resting, so they call it the resting stage. But these are considered stages of mitosis. International Prime Minister arrested and tortured, that is representing prophase, that is representing metaphase, and that is representing anaphase, and that is called telophase. So please, you need to know, watch out for my other videos and see what happens in each of those stages. Identify the stage of mitosis shown in the diagram. So you can see the chromosomes are pulling away. So when they are actually pulling away, it's anaphase. If the chromosomes were lined up in the middle, it would have been meta, like for middle, metaphase. If they are pulling away, that's anaphase. When they reach and they are reforming, that's telophase. If the spindle fibers, these guys, the spindles are, the centrioles are moving to opposite poles, that will be prophase. So watch out the video where you can learn that in my other series. Which of the following organism can be classified as having a body which is not segmented but having 4 pairs of legs? So having a body that is not segmented, I think a tick may be classified as one of that. Okay, let's conclude with this. It says, which of the following is not a method of improving and retaining soil fertility? So these questions are just one and the same, so please pay attention. And so there's conservation farming, crop rotation, crop harvesting, and weeding. So which of is not a method of improving soil and improving and retaining soil fertility? Obviously, crop harvesting. When you're harvesting, you're not doing any of that. 37, the diagram shows the nitrogen cycle. So this is the nitrogen cycle. Please study it, because you'll be able to see a lot of these questions in your exams. So they have actually given you a whole lot there. Root nodules of legumes, okay, they can fix nitrogen back into the soil. Amino acid and proteins in plant and animals. So when they die, so death may occur and you return it into the soil. In which stage of the nitrogen are nitrogen fixing bacteria important? So nitrogen fixing bacteria are important, one, in the roots of root nodules of legumes, because they help to fix nitrogen into the soil. Then two, there's also important when nitrogen from the atmosphere is being converted into ammonia. So basically 2 and 3 were the best options there. Which of the following would be an effect of clearing large forests for agricultural purposes? When you clear a large forest, of course, that may contribute to soil erosion, but also a lot of species in the area will decrease, because they'll either get extinct or they'll move away. So C is the best option. The variety of species in the area would actually decrease. 39, which human activity is likely to contribute most to global warming? So increase of the Earth's temperature, leading to flooding. So usually that is caused by emission or from burning of fossil fuel. When we burn things, we retain carbon dioxide, which is simply a greenhouse gas that causes global warming. 40, the following are the economic reasons for maintaining biodiversity except, so there's deforestation, there's medicinal purpose. Medicinal purpose is one reason of maintaining biodiversity, source of food, and also tourism, but not deforestation. Watch out also my the 2024 biology paper 1 that I revised. You'll be able to see something. Thank you so much for watching. See you in my next video.